Well, I want to give a welcome to our other venues that are joining us at the Jeff City campus, as well as Woodcrest at the Edge, and those who may be watching woodcrestworldwide.org as well, and certainly for our audience here on the Nifong campus. Our guest speaker this weekend is a tenured professor at the University of Connecticut. He holds a degree in sociologist from the University of Wisconsin. And about 8 months or so ago, he had the featured article, the cover article, in Christianity Today, which is, as church leaders, kind of our trade journal, if you will. And the article itself was just incredibly fascinating, paradigm shifting in many kinds of ways, but something that deeply resonated with me and with our staff around here and other church leaders to say there's something profoundly true about this that we need to pay attention to. That turned me on to more investigation, and we began to look and see what other writings were available. And as a result of that, ran across this guy, Brad. So Brad, delighted that you've joined us in Central Missouri. I sent him an email and said, hey, how about if you come out for what we casually call Theology Weekend at the end of July? And he graciously agreed, said, sounds like fun. So we've spent several days together, and he's done some mentoring, as well as the opportunity to speak here. So we're delighted to have you here in Columbia.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed being here this weekend.
And Brad has a book entitled Christians Are Hate-Filled Hypocrites and Other Lies You've Been Told. And basically what he's doing is he's looking at the issue of truth in publishing and media and asking the question, is what we're hearing, the paradigms of what's being promoted, are they essentially true? Does the empirical data actually back them up? And specifically, as that's applied to the Christian faith, in what ways might we be helped by considering whether or not the stories that we're telling are actually true, our premise is right. Anyway, I think you'll find lots of application in your own world as well as what it means in terms of promoting this message of truth and beauty, as he calls it, in our world today. So we're delighted to have him. So would you give a warm Woodcrest welcome to Dr. Bradley Wright. Brad, glad to be here. Thank you.
I'm always a little uncomfortable when someone introduces me as doctor because I'm a sociologist. So if you fall over clutching something, of no help. It's like, that's awkward. Let me step over you and move on. What I want to talk about today is how do we perceive Christianity? In particular, how do we perceive the Christian church and Christians here in the United States? And the point I'm going to make is that for various reasons, we have a very negative, skewed, kind of harsh view of Christianity, and that it's harmful to us. And so I'm going to walk you through that idea, and we're going to explore a little bit about where it might come from, why we have it, what are some of the implications of it, and what we might do about it. But to start with, you just can't put a professor in front of people, not have somebody give somebody a test. So when I see people in front of me, I just got to test you. So let me give you a test here. I'm going to give you 9 statements, and I want you just to keep a mental tally of how many you think are correct. Okay? Now since there's 9 statements, you can only go to 9. If you go to 12, you've done something wrong. So the first statement, and I phrase these as true or false questions, and they're empirical statements. And they're about American Christianity. So just keep in mind, how many do you think are true? The first is that American Christianity is losing its young people at a record pace. The second is that this is a historical low point for American Christianity. That, looking back all the way to the colonial era to now, we have fewer people, less involved in Christianity than ever before. The third one is that American Christians divorce as often or more often than non-Christians. The fourth one is that Christians exhibit the same sexual behavior as non-Christians, including what we would call sexual sin, or sexual behavior that is outside of what is prescribed in Christianity. Fifth one, Christians are more racially prejudiced than non-Christians. So that we have attitudes towards other races and minorities, minority groups and ethnic groups that are prejudicial. Sixth one, Christian attendance is down, or church attendance is down. So among people who are still Christians, we attend church less often than we used to. Seventh one is the same thing, but about prayer. Is it true that people who are Christians now pray less often than Christians used to? The eighth one is that among Christians, evangelism is down. So people who define themselves as Christians now are less likely and less willing and less frequently share what they believe with others than they used to. And the ninth one is that non-Christians have a less favorable opinion of us now than they used to. That we're held in lower regard society-wide than we used to be. Okay, so I've given you 9 statements. How many of those do you think are true? Got a couple, 9, got 4, or you just bid it in an auction, I'm not sure. Okay, other guesses? Okay, so I think we're all over the range. I think I'm hearing more 7, 8s, and 9s than 0, 1, 2s. The answer is 1. One of those statements is correct. Now, what I'd like to point out is a couple things. First of all 9 of those statements are things that I've heard. They're all things that I've read in books or heard in sermons or heard in talks or read in articles. Another thing, did you notice how little agreement there was? We went all the way from 0 to 9. And that shows that we don't really exactly know what's going on with important aspects of Christianity. I mean, these are all important things. These are things that matter to the Christian church in the United States. And we're not sure what's going on. Now, wouldn't it be funny if I didn't tell you which one was right? It'd be even funnier if I didn't after saying that. Number 5, Christians are more racially prejudiced than non-Christians. That's the one that's empirically correct. The other 8 aren't, but that one is. Now, even with that dark cloud, because that is bad news, there is some good news. Christians and non-Christians alike are much less racially prejudiced now than they were in previous decades. And it's going down at a very fast clip. And that's a wonderful thing, because racial and ethnic diversity is an important part of the kingdom of God. So there is some good news in that, but there's also bad news. And so I want to use this quiz, besides the fact I just like giving people tests, I want to use it to illustrate a way of thinking about Christianity, and that is, let's be accurate, let's be honest, let's take things at face value. There'll be some bad things, but there'll be a lot of good things. So yeah, walk away here thinking about the thing that we're doing worse than non-Christians, but think about the 8 things that are going pretty well. So I'm calling for a more nuanced view of how Christianity is doing, and there's a lot of good news. So my basic premise is this. There's something that I would call the Christian failure narrative. That it's a way of talking about Christianity that takes a certain stylized form. So you can think of, there's different kinds of music. There's both country and Western, and then rock and rap and hip-hop and whatnot. And there are different ways of playing music. In the same sense, there's different ways of talking about things. And those are called narratives. And I'm saying there's a certain way of talking about American Christianity that emphasizes its negative aspects and its failures. And so I call it a Christian failure narrative. As an academic, I earn more points if I make up words and phrases, and so that's why it's a phrase rather than just a sentence. And the point with the Christian failure narrative is that we hear a lot of bad news about American Christianity. We hear it from outside of the church, we hear it from inside the church, for various reasons that we'll explore. And that has implications about how we believe and how we act. And when Christianity does do good things, when Christians do the right thing, when churches have a positive impact, we just don't hear it. Okay, so let's explore this Christian failure narrative a bit. By the way, it's really weird turning sideways and like seeing a giant me over there. Thank you. You notice they toned it down. The first service I did that, I turned around, I realized I sucked in my gut, and then I couldn't talk because I wasn't breathing. I was like, this isn't going to last for 30 minutes. So I'm hitting the gym when I go home. Okay? So where do we get this Christian failure narrative? I'm going to identify 3 sources. The first is the secular media. Now, I don't mean to alarm you, and forgive me if I dispel some of your cherished beliefs, but the media isn't necessarily interested in your well-being. They're not fundamentally concerned with what is true and beautiful and accurate. More than anything, they have very base motives. They want viewers. They want readers. They want listeners, almost regardless of the content of what they present. So we have hundreds, thousands of channels. The people who run those channels have one overriding concern in their mind, and that is, how can I get people to watch this channel? When you're flicking through the channels, how can I get the viewer to stop and watch what I'm doing? Because if the viewer watches, if the reader reads, if the listener listens, then they can charge more for their advertising, they get paid more, they get promoted, everyone in the organization lives happily ever after. So they're very concerned about what you view and how much you view, and they put a lot of time into it. In fact, this last week, my family just finished up being an official Nielsen family. So for a week, we had to write down everything we watched on TV. Now, I thought as an act of pure cultural terrorism and spite that I would put that I watched Jersey Shore 24/7 and bump up their ratings, but I thought, no, I can't do that to my country. We see this focus on getting viewers by what the media chooses to present. Here's an easy example. On television news programs and in the newspapers, what do they emphasize about flight? So when airplanes take off and land, they don't care if it happens successfully. So thousands of planes take off, thousands land. But each year, like thousands minus 1 or 2 land because a couple crash. And that makes the news. It makes the news even if it happens in other countries. As a result, the media portrayal of airline travel is that it's fairly dangerous. If 1 in 10,000 flights crashes, and I think that's even too low, or I think that's too high, I think it's less than that. But if 1 in tens of thousands of flights crash, that gets a lot of news. It doesn't matter that they land safely. So as a result, if you take the media portrayal of air flight at face value, you would think airplane travel is very dangerous. Well, in actuality, if you look at the statistics, you're in more danger driving to the airport than you are flying once you get to the airport. Now, I don't mean to alarm you about driving to the airport, but airplane travel is amazingly safe, but we don't hear that because that's not quote-unquote interesting. So that begs the question, what's interesting about American Christianity? Or what's interesting for the media about Christianity? And what I would say is that what's most interesting, what's most quote-unquote newsworthy, is when Christians don't act like Christians. So when Christians are kind and loving and serving others, that's not interesting. But when we act immorally, that is interesting. Let me give you a couple examples. I read in the newspaper several months ago of a shoplifting incident in Iowa. No, it's in Illinois, at a Walmart. Now, I live in Connecticut, which is about 1,000 miles from Illinois. Why in the world am I reading about a shoplifting instance in Walmart? There's hundreds of Walmarts between me and Illinois. They all have multiple shoplifters that they catch a day. Of those thousands and thousands of shoplifters, why am I reading about this one? Because the person only stole $60, $80 worth of stuff. Why is it in the news? It was a Catholic priest. Everyone's like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that. Let's put that in the news. And so it shows sort of the selective portrayal of people by their morals if they're Christians. Let me give you a hypothetical example. Say there's a town with hundreds of pastors, and all but one love people, serve people, take care of the poor, minister to the sick, preach the word, are humble and kind and loving. They're not going to make it into the newspaper. Who will be on the front page? Well, it'll be the pastor who wakes up in a shopping cart, in front of a sorority on some weekend morning, covered with whipped cream and lipstick, That's front page. And by the way, I've had to add details each service just to keep Rod interested in that. No, I'm kidding. It's actually Pete who wanted the details. I'm just kidding, Pete's mom. It's a total joke. So it's when pastors act immorally that we hear about them in the news. But the truth of the matter is, at least from my experience, pastors are among the most generous and kind and honorable and respectful and giving people that I know. I think our country would be in a much better place if more people acted like their pastors. Let me give more of an empirical example of different receptivity to stories about American Christianity. So there's a website called dig.com, D-I-G-G.com, and it's a user-generated news aggregator. And so what you do is you link to stories that you think are interesting, and then other people on the website read the story, and if they think it's more interesting, they give it a thumbs up. If they think it's less interesting, they give it a thumbs down. And then what they present on the website are the most interesting stories as voted upon. So it's sort of like the reader becomes the editorial board. So when I was writing my first book, I took a break, looked at Dig, and I thought, this is interesting. There's a story there about what I'm researching. The story said, atheists less likely to divorce than Christians. And it had some statistics below it. And I thought, that's interesting because I actually know what the story is, and that's inaccurate. So by that point, I'd looked into it for about a month and looked at several different data sources and read everything I could find. So I probably knew more than anyone else in the country about that narrow issue. There's only like 4 or 5 people who care, so it's not that big a deal. But to the extent it was a big deal, I was the man. And I thought, this is just wrong. So as an experiment, I put a story on there, because remember, you can put your own stories, that said, Christians have lower divorce rates than atheists, which is empirically correct. And I put a little rationale why, about the same length, same writing style as the previous story. I tried to match them up a bit. And then I waited to see what would happen. At the end of the week, the first story, the one that was inaccurate but portrayed sort of a morally ironic story of Christians, had 3,500 upvotes. So 3,500 people read it and said, hey, this is great. I like it. It's interesting. And as a result, it was one of the most voted for stories of the week, and it was featured very prominently. So if you went on Dig that week, that's the story you would see. The story I put up there that was more accurate but less interesting got 10 digs, got 10 votes. Now, I don't feel like deeply betrayed by this or anything. It illustrates that good news about Christianity isn't interesting to read in the news. And so we just don't hear much of it. Now, I think at one point, I was a little harsher on the media than I am now. I've gotten to the point where I actually don't think that the media picks on Christians per se. I think they just sort of pick on everyone, because they apply this logic to everyone. So, which Olympians do you hear about? Well, it's the people who win the medals, but it's also the ones who get kicked off their teams for drug abuse or substance abuse. And I think the media just looks for the interesting, ironic portrayal, and therefore inaccurate, broad representation of everything. So even with politicians, if they give a 50-minute speech, it's the one gaffe at minute 37 that'll make the news. So with Christianity, what that means is we hear a lot of news about Christians acting immorally. But it doesn't stop there, because if it did, I think we'd be okay. But this Christian failure narrative has found perhaps its greatest home here in the Christian church, among Christian leaders in particular. Most Christian leaders, and here I'll just throw in everyone, pastors, writers, authors, denomination leaders, bloggers, I mean, you put whoever you want. People who shape Christian thought, who are Christians themselves. As a whole, most of them want to advance the kingdom of God. They want to do what they think is best for the church. So they're acting with the best of intentions. Out of those intentions, they want to give a strong message. They want to turn things around. They want to give a message about how the church can do better. So what's a good way to get people to take your message of improvement seriously? Well, tell them they're doing badly. That's a very effective rhetorical hook. So if you're going to teach about families and the importance of marriage, well, if you could trot out that statistic that Christians are failing in this area, what a good way to get your audience to listen to your solutions. Or if you write a book and it's about some topic that you want to change people's behavior on, you'll make chapter 1, here's the problem. Here's how Christians are failing. In fact, if you go to the Christian bookstore, pick up Christian Living books, fairly often the first chapter will be, here's how Christianity is failing. And chapters 2 through 8 are, here's what Christianity should do. As a result, there's a lot of pressure, and again, with the best of intentions, but to pick the most negative portrayal of our faith as a way of encouraging people to move forward in the faith. So you can see the way I phrased it, that there's it's ironic that we do that, and I'll develop that further. A third reason, in addition to the secular media, and in addition to Christian leaders, is just the quality of statistics themselves. As someone who creates statistics for a living, I can tell you some statistics are bad. They're just flat out wrong. Now, this shouldn't surprise you. Is there anything that you can think of that doesn't have variation in quality? There are some good restaurants, there are bad restaurants. There are good baseball teams, there are bad baseball teams. There are good places to go fishing, there are bad places. There are good houses, there are bad houses. Likewise, some statistics are just flat out inaccurate. And if they're negative, then they're very attractive to people who want to use them for good reasons or bad. Now, some statistics are just created badly. But even statistics that are created well, that are accurate, and give a useful representation of the world, can be turned into inaccurate statistics with each retelling. Now, when I was young, back in the Great Depression, my elementary school teachers would play this game to teach us not to gossip or something, or just to fill the time. I forget what it was for. But they called the telephone game. So they'd sit us in a circle, and the teacher would whisper something to the person on their left, and then they would whisper it to the person next to them, and it'd work its way around the circle, and it'd come back to the teacher. And so it'd start off as something, have a nice day, and it'd work its way around, and by the time it came back, it was, free Paraguay now, or something completely unrelated to the original message. Paraguay is actually not oppressed, so yeah, that was a joke. I don't want to start a movement here. In the same sense, with each retelling, statistics get less accurate, or can get less accurate, and they tend to get more dire, more negative, more extreme. And I've actually traced this. In my book, I traced one of the statistics, and it goes from benign to just malevolent with each retelling, because each one frames it a little differently, it becomes different information. So I've proposed to you that there's something that I call the Christian failure narrative, and I've given you a couple ideas of why we might have it. Rather than just to assert it, let me give you some case studies that illustrate bad statistics that have made it into our public consciousness as Christians. And I want to start with divorce rates. This is the one that actually got me into the research, because in graduate school I got married, and I've been married 21 years since, and the first 5-8 years were tough. Marriage is difficult, especially for my wife. And we got so much support from our small group, from our pastor, from teaching, that it really helped contribute to the longevity of our marriage, to us staying together and having a good marriage. And so when I would hear in church that Christians divorce just as often or more than non-Christians, it just didn't make sense to me. It wasn't my experience at all. And as a sociologist, I thought, how would all that socialization and social support not have a good effect? How would it have a bad effect? So I started looking into the data. And lo and behold, it turns out that, in fact, Christians divorce less often than non-Christians. So if you ask people, have you been married? And those who say yes say, have you ever been divorced? Or are you currently separated? If you ask, that's one way of measuring a divorce rate. If you ask that of people who are religiously unaffiliated, about 50% will say yes. Of those who have been married, 50% will say, yes, I've been divorced, or I am currently separated. About 46% of evangelicals will say yes, 41% of mainline Protestants, and 35% of Catholics. So there is a difference. If you want to talk about statistical significance, I'll say there is statistically significant difference between Christians and even evangelicals and people who have no religious affiliation. Now, we can look at these data and say, that's the 35, 41, and 46% are unacceptable. Let's do better. And I would say, amen, that's right. So this isn't a call for complacency. This is a call for accuracy. We can look at these data and say, well, we're in the right direction, but not far enough. Super. I like that way of thinking. But that's very different than we're absolutely failing and we're doing worse than anyone else. And in looking at the data, I found a more interesting story. What about evangelicals and divorce rates and how often they go to church? It turns out that if you look at people who define themselves as evangelical but never go to church, or only go to church once a year or every couple months, their divorce rates are as high, if not higher, than people who are unaffiliated with any religion. But if you look at the people who go every week or just about every week, their divorce rate is substantially lower. It's 38% instead of 53, 55, or 60%. Well, suddenly the story becomes very different. If we just say Christians divorce as much or more often than non-Christians, the story is really church isn't working. So we have to change everything. But if we look at these data, maybe the story that comes out is that church is working. And the problem isn't that church isn't working, it's that we're not getting people to go to church enough. Do you see how fundamentally different an approach that is? Let me give you another example. With Unchristian. This book came out a couple years ago. It was published by the Barna Research Group. And its basic idea was that Christianity has an image problem. The story goes something like this. We've acted so badly for so long that non-Christians don't like us anymore, and nor should they. And this is a problem for Christianity, because if people don't like us, they're not going to hear our message. If people don't like us, they're not going to believe our good intentions in doing work in the world. And not only do people not like us, it's getting worse over time. They like us less than they used to. So we're approaching disaster. In fact, one person writing spoke of the last Christian generation, that somehow this is it. So blink your eyes because it's going to, or take it in now because it's going to be gone for your kids. And not only that, it's the young people in our country who really don't like Christians, especially evangelical Christians. And that's terrible, the story goes, because they're the ones we want to reach. They're our hope for the future. So this is a pretty dire story, and it's a dire story that sold over 100,000 copies. But what's really going on? Well, it turns out there are some data that measure what people think about evangelical Christianity. So I found about 8 or 9 different surveys since 1990 that asked Americans, what do you think of this religion? What do you think of the people in that religion? What do you think of the people in this other religion? And one of the religions was evangelical Christianity. And so this is a graph that plots out over the last 20 years unfavorable attitudes toward evangelical Christians. The higher the dot, the more unfavorable it is. The y-axis, that's the thing that goes up and down on the left, goes from 0 to 80%. And then the x-axis, which is the thing across the bottom, goes from 1990 to 2007. The green line is people who are religiously unaffiliated. So Americans over the last 20 years who have no religious affiliation started off in the 1990s having unfavorable attitudes towards evangelical Christians at about 70%. So 7 out of 10 people who had no religion in 1990 had unfavorable attitudes towards evangelical Christians. But you know what? That dropped down to 40% this last decade. For people of other religions that aren't Christian religions, it went from the 60 percentile to about 35, 38 percentile. For the whole population, it went from about 40% to about 20%. So the fact of the matter is that even though we have an image problem and they like us less now than they used to, story is compelling and riveting and sells books and gets people to give powerful sermons, it's factually incorrect. People like us more now than they did before. Now, it's an open issue to me whether or not we should care about what people think about us. But putting that aside, I just want to point out the inaccuracy, the factual, empirical, data-driven, survey-generated inaccuracy of the story. And yet everyone readily believed it. So those are two examples of incorrect information. And the second example we can take even further, because when you look at the data by age, it's not the young people who disapprove of evangelicals the most. In fact, only about 32% to 36% of people from 18 to 50 have a negative view of evangelicals. It's the older people, age 50 and above, who have an unfavorable view. So this changes the story from the dramatic, panic-stricken, we're losing the next generation, to more of, oh, what's Grandpa cranky about now? It's a very different story. But it's one that won't sell 100,000 books, even though it's accurate. So why do we care about this? Well, at some level, it's an interesting intellectual exercise. Why do we believe what we believe? That's something sociologists care about. But for the practice of Christianity, I would tell you that this overriding negative viewpoint we have, to the point of severe inaccuracy, has several problems for us. One, it hinders the mission of the church. It's very discouraging. Why in the world would you want to devote yourself to an institution, to people who are an abject failure? Why would you want to bring people onto it? Why would you want to reach out and say, come join me? It's a failure. Come on, it'll be great. It's sort of like selling tickets to the Titanic after you hit the iceberg. It just doesn't make sense. When I've had the chance to be here for 3 or 4 days, and I've enjoyed it very much, and I've enjoyed each of my interactions. And as part of it, Rod has very kindly taken me out for some good meals. And if he had said the first night, hey, I know of this restaurant where the food's terrible, it's greasy, it'll make you sick, the wait staff is tardy and surly, and there's no parking. Let's go. I'd be like, well, why are you doing this? I don't want to go. Well, isn't that what we're inadvertently doing with our Christian failure narrative? We want to promote Christianity, but by trashing it so badly, by speaking of its failure so often, aren't we giving people a disincentive? Aren't we taking away motivation to reach out? Another issue regards truth. As I understand Christianity, there's an element of absolute truth to it. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's culturally relative, and we have to think through, and there's a lot of gray in what we do, but at its heart, there's black and white. Truth matters in Christianity. It's not just, hey, whatever works for you is good for you. There's an element of truth, absolute truth to it. Does promoting falsehoods to advance truth make sense? There's an element of the ends justifies the means thinking here. That as long as I am reaching more people with information about how to advance what we're doing, it's okay if I use falsehoods to get their interest. And as I understand ethics, this ends justify the means thing isn't good. A third reason is more theological. Now, I'm about as good at theology as most theologians are at statistics. So if I get into heresy, they have somebody to grab me real fast off the stage and just ignore what I say. But as I understand it, the Christian church holds a special place in God's eyes. That it's not just another human organization. It's not just the bowling league, the Kiwanis Club, the National League, National League fan club or something. Rather, it holds an important place. In fact, part of Jesus' mission, as I understand it, here on earth was to create the church. And that was his charge to the disciples, and that's what they devoted themselves to. In fact, the Bible refers to it as the bride of Christ. Now, that's very honorific language. It's very special language. If, in fact, the church is very important and very dear to God's heart, shouldn't we be careful how we talk about it? Shouldn't we have a measured, thoughtful, loving, constructive tone? I'm not saying we can't criticize it, but just whipping it like we do so often, I don't know if that's a good idea. Let me put it this way. If you talked about my bride the way that many Christians talk about the bride of Christ, we can't be friends. You just can't talk that way about my wife to me. It's just not happening. So I think there's a place for a reverence in how we talk about the works of God, and I believe the Christian church to be a work of God. Of course, there's still room for sort of a prophetic approach of criticism and correction, but that's still a long ways away from just sort of the wholesale disparaging and trashing that we get now. So what should you do about all this? I've given you an idea. I've given you some examples. I've explained to you why I think the idea identifies problems with our faith. So what should you do? Well, at some level, there's not much you can do because you're going to keep on hearing the Christian failure narrative. It's too powerful. It sells too many books. It gets too many listeners. It gets too many readers. In fact, after I wrote this book, a very well-known Christian, and I won't say his or her name, but if I did, a lot of you would know it, had spent a year encouraging me with this, promoting my material, sending me emails telling me how he or she liked it. But when his or her book came out, they went and got the most negative statistic to sell it. That was chapter 1. And they actually sent me an apology for doing it. It was awkward. But it made me realize that the incentive to get the extra reach, get the extra listeners, to have a bigger impact is so strong, we will always hear the Christian failure narrative. So that's my prediction. I just want to sensitize you to it. I want you to be aware of it so that you can distance yourself from it. You're always going to hear about plane crashes more than you are safe plane landings. You're always going to hear more about Christian failure than you are Christian positive things. But the Christian positive things exist far more frequently than the failures. So, why not be critical in your evaluation of information that you receive about American Christianity? We're called, as I understand it, to love people unconditionally, regardless of their flaws. But that extends to people, not information. With information, you can be everything that you want to be, but you shouldn't with people. Cranky and skeptical and irritated and short-tempered. Great, that's a good way to approach information. So when I sit down for a dissertation defense or something, legs cross, arms cross, I scowl. It's like, okay, you're going to have to talk me into this because I don't believe it already and I haven't heard it. But that means that I'm prone to weed out the bad information and keep what's good. There's a winnowing and sifting approach here that I think is useful. And so I encourage you to do that. You don't have to accept everything you hear. Along those lines, think for yourself about what you hear. Think about whether it measures up to your own experiences. So I spoke to someone after an earlier service, and they said, I guessed correctly. It was 1 out of 9. And then she explained, I based it on the churches I've been to. I said, at this church, is this happening? No. Is this happening? No. Is this happening? No. One she wasn't sure about, and so that was the one that she voted yes for. Now, I'm not saying that you should be someone who believes only what they experience and not any other information. But also, you could go too far the other way, and that is to completely ignore your experiences. So think for yourself. Does this make sense? As a sociologist, as a professional information person, I probably take this too far, and to the irritation of my friends and family. A couple years ago, I went out with my wife and her brother, and he'd be my brother-in-law. We're sitting there at dinner, and he throws out a statistic. And he's outraged by it. He's like, "Can you believe this?" And he went on a bit of a rant. And I said, "Well, actually, I don't believe it." And he looked at me, and obviously I didn't hear him right because he said it was a statistic, so he repeated it. I said, "Well, I still don't believe it." And he looked at me just bewildered, like, how could I not do that? I mean, it's almost un-American not to believe every statistic you hear. It's like I slapped his dog. I mean, it's like I violated some norm. It was very, very difficult for him to understand. So then he pulled out the gold standard of statistical proof. I read it. He said, "But I read it." I said, "Well, I don't care. I mean, people write down what I say. It doesn't mean it's right, although with me it is." So me being who I am, I got out a napkin and I wrote, "I don't believe it." I gave it to him. I said, "There, now you read that." Don't do that. He didn't talk to me for 3 days. But I thought I illustrated the purpose. So don't be rude. Leave that to us sociologists. But you don't have to believe everything you hear. And that leads to the next point, and that is you're free to challenge people on the information that you hear. If somebody trots out the song and dance about American Christianity failing, say, "Are you sure that you know that? Where did you learn that? Did you think about the information that you received?" So Rod, on his barn burner of a vacation, when he wasn't tearing up the thrift stores, was at a seminary class. And he was telling me a story about how one of the younger pastors there brought out the big statistic of how we're losing all the young people and it's imminent disaster for American Christianity. And he raised his hand and said, "Do you know that that's true? Because I don't think that's true, and I've read some things that suggest it's not." And that changed the entire conversation from sort of self-flagellation to, well, what's really going on here? So you're free to challenge people. Now, just as a courtesy to your pastors, wait until you're done. Wait until they're done with the sermon before you challenge them. But there's no reason that in day-to-day conversation you can't challenge people with what you hear. What I'd like to see us do as a church is to develop a new narrative, a new way of talking about American Christianity. So I want to move away from it's a complete failure, do more. But I also want to avoid the other extreme of, hey, everything's going well, head back in the sand, we're okay. And let's try to look as accurately as possible of what's going well and what's not going well. If things are going badly, let's try to make them good. If things are going good, let's try to make them great. It's a different way of talking about it, but it's a more encouraging approach. We're not the Titanic. If we're a ship going at 3/4 speed in about the right direction. But there's plenty of room for improvement. We can go faster. We can go more of where we want to. So I want this new narrative to be, here are the ways we're doing well. Let's do even better. Let's go for great. Let's go from good to great, as is phrased in a different context. Paul, in the book of Colossians, demonstrates this approach. He writes, "We have heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love you have for all the saints." Okay? For those of you new to Christianity, love and faith are good. Okay, so he's saying, you're doing good things. But later he says, "I pray that you might bear fruit even more." Now, in other places, Paul really takes people to task. But here he shows that's not his only narrative. That's not his only approach to people. And I would say with American Christianity, very often, we should say to ourselves, we have faith in Christ Jesus. We have love for all the saints. And then, let's bear more fruit. Because that's the narrative that I think will be most powerful and is most accurate and is most respectful of the many good works that are happening in the church. So what I hope to have accomplished with all of this is to help you to step away from the ongoing negative message that you hear and will hear, and think about it for yourself and to appreciate much more fully and richly the good things that are happening in American Christianity and the good things that our faith brings to our lives in the world. Now, if you would like more of this sort of sociology of Christianity, and gosh, who wouldn't? I have a blog entitled Black, White, and Gray that I write with several other sociologists who are Christians themselves. And you can find it just Googling Black, White, and Gray. I also have a Twitter account and other information at my website, which is brewright.com. They're my initials followed by my last name. Unfortunately, it spells brew right. And I don't drink coffee or beer, but if I did, I would have the website for it. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Brad. Well, what Brad covers today was in this book again, Christians Are Hate-Filled Hypocrites and Other Lies You've Been Told, but he also has a sequel to that, which is surprising good news about the state of our world. And so some of the chapters in here where this book was applied to Christianity, this one applies to, are we worse off financially? Are we dumber? Are we sicker than we used to be? Are we stressed and unhappy? What about crime and war, the environment? And then finally, the counting of blessings. And so commend that one to you as well. One of the subplots, I think, of what we've experienced this weekend is that Brad has this quite impressive curriculum vitae in academia related to homelessness and criminology that he's been working on for years. But in his profession, he's always also asking the question, how can I use my authority and knowledge to advance the purposes that are honoring to God, love and grace and the health and work of local churches? And he has served our community quite well and is serving quite well. And I think it's an admonition to those of us in whatever vocation that we are in, that we take our influence as well and ask, how might we use it in these kinds of courageous ways to do the kinds of good things that I think are being done by the message that you heard. And I'd just like to add, so thank you again, Brad, for doing that. That's a great, great